Lolita is weird, right? And I don't mean the book, or the fashion style, or the anime trope. I mean all three. See, depending on who you talk to, the word has a different meaning. In the context of literature, it refers to the 1955 book about a literature professor who really likes his 12-year-old stepdaughter. In the context of Japanese animations, it refers to a character who appears to be a little girl, even if they're actually much older. This is often shortened to simply calling such a character a lolly. In the context of fashion subcultures, it's a style of dressing that generally includes a lot of ribbons, lace, and layers, and has round shapes but maintains a generally hourglass silhouette. How on earth can it be all three? And why have we just accepted this? Well, have you ever heard of the word etymology? For my money, this is the most interesting one of the modern age, and it starts with the book, which, as far as I can tell, is indeed the origin of the word. Lolita the book was written by Vladimir Nabokov, a Russian-American who was born and grew up in St. Petersburg, but was forced to flee overseas with his family around 1919 in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and the end of the Russian Civil War, which the Communist Party won. The book itself is written from the perspective of Humbert, a French man who, unable to get over his childhood crush's premature death, develops a fetish for girls who look like her. Through a series of mishaps, Humbert finds himself looking for a place to stay in New England, USA, and there he meets the titular character, Dolores, whom he calls Lolita. She supposedly looks just like his childhood love, and in order to get closer to her, Humbert marries her widowed mother. Many distressing things then happen, including the mother's death, sleeping pills being used, kidnapping, murder, and then finally Humbert's arrest. I won't go into the finer details, you probably get the gist. For a quick snapshot, it's a bit like Poor Things, but if Bella Baxter actually looked the age she is mentally. The book was extremely controversial, as you might imagine, but also eventually a mixed critical success, with several supporters emerging. Not because they agreed or identified even with the protagonist, but more so because as a piece of literature it gave interesting insight into the minds of the mentally disturbed. Whether intended to be a condemnation of the sexualization of young girls or not, the book did help popularize the notion to a whole new generation of... And make no mistake, that is what the character of Humbert is. At the end of the book, when he's in prison reflecting on his actions, he even thinks to himself, if he was on the jury, he would give himself a life sentence for the things he has done. Whereas a modern interpretation like Poor Things gives back power to the female by making it from her point of view and framing it as her choice to enjoy sexual freedom and gain empowerment from it. In Lolita, it's less clear what the takeaway is. Since the breakout success of the book, when the word Lolita is used in Western popular media now, it tends to refer to young women who are trying to attract the attention of older men by behaving sexually. Gigi Durham talks more about this and the sexualization of young girls in her book, The Lolita Effect. In that book, she importantly and correctly flags that Lolita, or Dolores, was not ever a character that actually behaved that way. It is evident from these examples that Lolita is our favourite metaphor for a child vixen, a knowing coquette with an out-of-control libido, a baby nymphomaniac. This creature fulfills the fantasy projected by Humbert, yet she is worlds away from the original Lolita, who neither initiated nor provoked her non-consensual sexual relationship with Humbert. She is remembered in the public consciousness as a vixen, in large part thanks to the poster for the Stanley Kubrick film adaptation of the book. This image is the one people think of when they hear the word, and the way the character sucks on the lollipop leaves little to the imagination about what the implication is. This confusing legacy of a girl who is a victim but is remembered for something else entirely then leads us into Le Portrait de Petite Cosette. Le Portrait de Petite Cosette, or Le Portrait de Petite Cosette for pretentious people, is a Japanese animated miniseries that came out back in 2004. The series is very clearly inspired by the plot of Lolita. Cosette, a young girl who lived as an aristocrat in 18th century France, was killed by her older lover/fiancé because he wanted her to stay young and beautiful forever. Whether she was active or passive in pursuing this relationship is left very vague. Her soul, unable to move on, is now trapped in a drinking glass that has been picked up many years later by a Japanese boy who is the reincarnation of her lover. The boy, falling in love with her, agrees to let her torture him until all of her resentment disappears so that her soul can pass. The real draw of this series, however, isn't its plot at all. It's the visuals. It's gothic horror to a T. There's candles dripping wax everywhere, and yet no environment is ever well lit. Harsh shadows fall across every character's face. Each splash of blood that appears does so with an artistic flourish. Notable architecture includes stained glass windows, rows of columns, patterned tiles. The walls of Cassette's home are filled with painted portraits. Also, a quick side note, the dialogue in this show is hilariously stilted. Man, can't my uncle stop buying all these antiques in Europe and sending them here to me in Japan where I have to sort them in his antique shop where I work? Yep, this is why I work at an antique shop, in case you were wondering. Like, who is he talking to in this scene? But another important element of the visuals is the clothing that Cassette wears. Oh, what's this? It looks just like the images of Lolita fashion I showed at the beginning of the video? Well, there just might be a reason for that. But I'm not saying that this series alone was so popular as to inspire an entire generation of new fashionistas to dress like this character specifically. In truth, Lolita fashion had existed in Japan since as early as the 1970s. But the question still remains where the style itself came from, and why it's named after a book from the 50s. Cassette can give us the answers to both, as the character herself is inspired by both meanings of the word. Proof of this is in the storyline, as it's similar to the book, but also in the first episode, where we see some graffiti with the words Gothic and Lolita on a street the main character walks down, with Gothic Lolita being a popular subcategory of the fashion with a focus on dark colours. The clothes Cassette wears are reminiscent of 18th century France, which makes sense, that's the time period the character is from. Specifically, her clothes are a blend of those worn by aristocratic young girls and aristocratic adult women. Whereas adult women in 18th century France were rocking the Marie Antoinette look with big wigs, bows and colours, younger girls wore short white frock dresses that stopped at the ankle to allow greater freedom of movement. Both elements are present in Lolita fashion, making it an intersection of childhood innocence and the maturity of womanhood. The creators of Cassette chose her origin very deliberately so that they could play into both meanings of Lolita and have her costuming choices seem natural. Their target audience was alternative teens and young adults who would already be familiar with the style. Okay, but why 18th century France? It can be at least partly attributed to the fact that this period in France heavily emphasized the pale skin of the face, which is also an aspiration in modern Japanese beauty standards. But it's also a style that is entirely European, which Japan has been known to have a bit of an obsession with. In somewhat the same way that European people from the golden age of trade found fashion from the far-off land of Japan to be exotic, Japan to a certain extent still thinks of old European fashion as exotic, because of how different it is from their own historic style of dress. But more than anything, it's just something different, period. Fashion subcultures often form around people or groups who don't like wearing clothes that they feel are commonplace or mainstream, because they don't feel it expresses how unique they are on the inside. In truth, Lolita fashion has very little at all to do with its namesake, other than making adults something which was originally childlike. Why choose it then? I don't know, because it sounds cute? Why do we call things POG when we could just say good? It's just more fun to say POG. Okay, that's 2 out of 3 down. Where did the word lolly come from? Le Portrait de Petit Cosette has spawned many series with a similar style. Most notably for our purposes, Moonphase, Dance in the Vampire Bund, and Gothic. Also Japanese animations that came out in 2004, 2010, and 2011 respectively. Look at the protagonists of these shows. You can clearly see the influence. All young looking, all the same sense of style. Often blonde, bonnets and headbands, gloves, round skirts that fall at the mid-thigh, lace and ribbons and bows. The gothic horror element is also still very much present in these shows through their plot lines. Moonphase and Dance in the Vampire Bund are both about vampires, and Gothic is a murder mystery show set in Europe. These characters are all now Lolitas in 2 senses. They're young girls who find themselves the love interest of older looking men, not as old as the book, but still, and they wear the fashion style that is now called Lolita. So why not just call them and characters like them Lolitas? Or if that's too much of a mouthful, let's shorten it to lollies. And then as time passes, the meaning will morph to mean any young-looking girl, no matter how she dresses or who her love interest is. I wish I was kidding, this is basically what happened. A lolly character is now a common trope in anime, especially harem anime, where you have the generic male lead and several girls fighting over his affections despite the fact he's the human equivalent of white bread. In every harem anime, you can pretty much count on there being at least one lolly character. She is normally the one saying "Onita" non-stop. There's a deeper discussion here to be had about Japan's obsession with children, but I have neither the time nor the willingness to open that can of worms right now. The best nuanced discussion I've seen on that topic was on the Trash Taste podcast. I don't remember which episode. Ta-da! We now reach today, where the word has 3 separate meanings and very few people stop to think about why. Except for me. And now as a result of my hyperfixation on certain ideas, you know too. How far we've strayed from the original meaning of the word is kind of hilarious, but also a testament to how quickly words fall in and out of fashion or evolve in the age of the internet. Like, remember that period of time parents on Facebook still thought LOL stood for lots of love? Some good anecdotes came out of that. Now half my friends can barely understand me when I'm talking about the Giga Chad take the dub Sigma male grind set. Or the hurt/comfort enemies to friends to lovers BL that is now my new alt ship. And I can't really blame them for that. But hopefully for those of you who didn't know anything about the word Lolita, now you do.